In 1976, George Lucas sat down to watch the first assembly of his science fiction film, The Star Wars. Based on the space adventure serials he had grown up loving, the script had gone through several vastly different iterations since Lucas first began seriously pursuing the idea in 1971. The shoot had been difficult, and no one else seemed to believe in the project. Still, he persisted, even putting his health in serious jeopardy.
I'm just writing about everything's coming to a close right now. How do you feel everything's nearly finished?
Tired.
Confident that when audiences and executives saw it on screen, they would finally understand. But before that, he had to see it for himself. An assembly of all production footage was cut together to match the shooting script by a British editor named John Jimson, with next to no input from Lucas. And when Lucas finally sat down to watch his passion project from start to finish for the very first time, it wasn't good. In fact, it was almost catastrophically bad. This moment is mythologized among the fanatics, at least the ones with a more filmmaking bent, because it was a turning point for Lucas and for Star Wars. Seeing the film in this dull, bloated, and prosaic form lit a fire under Lucas and his collaborators. The only way to fix the film was to start the editing over from scratch, so Lucas hired Paul Hirsch, Richard Chew, and his own wife, Marcia Lucas, to work from the ground up on a brand new cut.
It was cut in a very traditional manner of just playing things out in masters and then going into the coverage, and let the actors' rhythms dictate the cuts rather than having the cuts kind of drive the rhythm of the scenes. So consequently, there wasn't any excitement in the footage the way that it had been put together.
Overlap.
They worked to highlight what was working and jettison everything that wasn't, and the version that was left behind, that original assembly that necessitated a complete overhaul, is now known as the Lost Cut. The first thing you should know about the Lost Cut is, it's not lost. It's safely stored in the Lucasfilm archives, and it has probably even been scanned digitally. They said they've been doing that with every piece of film stock in that place as a precautionary measure. But that doesn't mean they'll ever release it. There's also not just one in-progress assembly of Star Wars. Movies are constantly evolving and changing throughout the editing process. A lot of what people think about when they think of the Lost Cut of Star Wars is an amalgamation of different works in progress. There was a completely silent version to get a sense of how it was working visually, a version with a soundtrack of temp music, including a lot of Gustav Holst's The Planets, and dozens of subsequent versions with minor trims, additions, and substitutions. There's the first version that Lucas watched alone, the cut that was infamously screened for his Hollywood buddies, including Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, and Brian De Palma, and the various versions made once the next team of editors was brought in. So the Lost Cut isn't lost, and it's not a cut. For the sake of clarity though, we'll talk about all the interesting stuff here, regardless of whether or not this would have all been in the same version of the film. Most of our information about the Lost Cut comes from a piece in the Star Wars Insider magazine by Dr. David West Reynolds, who was lucky enough to see a print in the Lucasfilm archives. His description of what he saw, along with material released officially and unofficially over the years, provide us with a pretty good sense of how the Lost Cut differs from the original theatrical version of Star Wars 1977. Everything else comes from Lucas's revised fourth draft of the script dated March 15th, 1976. Starting generally, our Lost Cut is in black and white. It was reportedly 13 reels long. A film reel generally gets you about 11 minutes of screen time, which would make the Lost Cut potentially as long as 143 minutes. The theatrical version of Star Wars clocks in at 121, so that's an additional 22 minutes that have been cut, and that means deleted scenes. It also means a generally slower pace throughout. Some action beats or lines of dialogue have been chopped off from the beginnings or ends of some scenes.
Well, there we are. Mos Eisley's spaceport.
And of the remaining footage, the moments that made it into the final release, reportedly 30 to 40% are alternate takes or angles.
I got a really bad feeling about this.
We'll also see more primitive effects shots, ones that Lucas later deemed unacceptable and were redone.
I'll get it!
Some that haven't been done at all yet, leaving unrotoscoped lightsabers, missing matte paintings, and full shots completely absent. And the final general difference between the theatrical and the Lost Cut is the presence of Onset audio only. That means no James Earl Jones.
Was there any of the royal family on board? Who were you carrying?
A very muffled Anthony Daniels.
And I am C-3PO, human-cyborg relation.
And Peter Mayhew performing English dialogue from inside the Chewbacca costume before his Wookiee vocalizations were created.
That old man's mad.
So let's start at the beginning of the film. You'll notice an alternate version of the Star Wars logo at the top of the iconic opening crawl. The crawl itself was originally not as concise or dynamic as the one we're now used to. In earlier drafts of the script, the crawl was originally even longer. At one point it was a full 6 paragraphs of heavy and inaccessible exposition. It's all interesting world building. You can tell Lucas has an incredible imagination, but it's just too much. Film director Brian De Palma, a friend of Lucas's, worked with him to pare it down to the essentials and to convey that in the most interesting way possible. The opening battle aboard the blockade runner, like most sequences, was cut down to the final version from from a longer shootout with a few more angles. As the rebels retreat, 3PO is knocked over in the firefight and falls into a mess of wires. This shot of 3PO was later repurposed as a coda to the "Here They Come" scene.
We did it!
Help! I think I'm melting. This is all your fault.
But I think the original intention was to explain why the droids were separated when Leia plants the Death Star plans on R2 later. On this somewhat awkward beat, we cut down to the planet for our first deleted scene. This is our introduction to Luke Skywalker, and it comes very early in this version. We're only on page 4 of the script, which translates to about 4 minutes into the film proper. For comparison, in the theatrical version, Luke doesn't appear until close to the 17-minute mark. This is the first of several scenes in the fully deleted subplot, showing Luke's life on Tatooine prior to coming into contact with the droids. Here we actually see Luke moisture farming, and it's about as exciting as it sounds. Something in the sky catches his attention. This is meant to be the chase and firefight between the Star Destroyer and Blockade Runner, shown in the opening scene of the film. Seeing this excites Luke as much as you would expect a glittering trail of sky triangles would, and he runs off to tell his friends about it. We know that the scene was cut when the other scenes in the subplot were, but just on its own, this is a really weird one. It comes so close to the beginning of the film and sticks out like crazy. There's a lot to take in, and a strange tonal whiplash. We were just in an exciting and explosive shootout with space Nazis, and now there's this quiet scene with the Three Stooges robot in the middle of the desert. The 1970s audience would be so confused. Already a pattern has become clear for the things that were cut or changed for the final release. Like the bloated original crawl, this scene front-loads the film with way too much unnecessary information. It's an understandable miscalculation on Lucas's part. By this point he had spent half a decade immersed in this world, but an audience seeing all this for the first time needs to be eased in gracefully. As Luke speeds away from this poor suffering droid, we cut back to the ship in orbit as Darth Vader makes his entrance. Going forward, he's going to be all David Prowse. As mentioned before, the Lost Cut was put together before ADR was done, so all of Vader's lines are Prowse's on-set deliveries through the mask.
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away.
The film continues as usual until the droids blast off in the escape pod.
Don't you call me a mindless philosopher, you overweight blob of grease! Bang! I'm going to regret this.
A matte painting of the planet, which was likely inserted into the film without the pod model comped in, will cut back to Luke's story on the surface. As Luke speeds into the settlement of Anchorhead, he was to have passed an old lady walking on the street. She turns to yell, "I've told you kids to slow down," as he zooms past her, but this beat was deleted before the speeder was added to the shot and the dialogue was recorded. Luke arrives at Tashi Station, the mythical place that he whines to his uncle about, in one of the last conversations he has with the man who raised him from infancy.
But I was going into Tashi Station to pick up some power converters.
In real life, the exterior scenes at Tashi Station in this scene and the next one, and the outskirts of Mos Eisley, were filmed at Sidi Jimor in Tunisia. Inside the station, we meet some of Luke's friends.
Hey, come on, shape it up, you guys. Kids! Hey! I didn't know you were back. What'd you get in?
Just now.
Okay.
I never expected you to be up working.
Well, the Academy didn't change you much.
They seem to treat Luke like an annoying younger brother, except for Biggs, of course.
What's all the noise about?
Back down here and play the game.
I think Wormy's caught too much sun.
I feel bad for these actors. Could you imagine being in a deleted scene for one of the most successful films of all time? We'll give him a shout out. Biggs Darklighter is played by Garrick Hagan. He's got it the least bad, of course. He appears as an X-Wing pilot in the original theatrical version of the film, and even had a deleted scene reinserted for the film special edition. The other speaking characters who weren't so lucky are Fixer, played by Anthony Forrest, and Cammy, played by Koo Stark. They don't make much of an impression, but Cammy fires off Luke's nickname Wormy, which makes up probably 25% of her lines.
Don't worry about it, Wormy.
Man, I'm glad they decided to cut characters having nicknames from these movies. There's a deleted runner in Empire where Leia keeps calling Han Hotshot, and it's awful.
Enjoy your trip, Hotshot. Okay, Hotshot.
But more on that some other time. This setting doesn't really feel like an alien planet, but maybe that would have made the Cantina sequence more effective later in the film. It's actually kind of interesting, the implication that Luke hasn't had a whole lot of contact with aliens until then. I know it's probably a budget issue rather than anything intentional, but Star Wars 77 and Empire Strikes Back use aliens a little differently than the subsequent films in the saga. They're much less commonplace in these two original films, and when they do appear, they signal danger or something foreign, but that's a tangent. Of course, adding these Anchorhead scenes comes at the expense of some of the drama with the droids wandering the desert. We might not fear Tatooine quite as much if we had seen teenagers playing space foosball here in the previous scene. After Leia and Vader's confrontation,
Take her away.
and the droids go both ways,
Seem to be made to suffer. It's our loss in life.
we come back here for the third and final scene in this deleted subplot.
You should have been there. It was fantastic.
You gotta take it a little easy, Luke. You may be the hottest bush pilot this side of Mos Eisley, but Those little skyhoppers are dangerous. Keep it up, one day, whammo. You're gonna end up a dark spot on the downside of a canyon wall.
This is the best of the 3 deleted scenes so far, but not by a lot. Ultimately, the information communicated here, Luke wanting to get off the planet and thinking that he never will, is communicated much better through scenes later in the film, particularly in the dinner scene and the following sunset moment. It's a classic show versus tell scenario. There's just way too much dialogue in the scene with Biggs, especially for the beginning of a film.
I wish I was going. Are you gonna be around long?
No. Leaving in the morning.
I guess I won't see you.
Maybe someday. I'll keep a lookout.
Yeah. I'll be at the Academy next season, and then who knows? I won't be drafted into the Imperial Starfleet, that's for sure. Well, take it easy, buddy. You'll always be the best friend I've ever had.
So long, Luke.
Oh wait, I forgot to tell you the story of why these scenes were deleted. It's ironic, because Lucas didn't even want to include them in the first place. He had intended to mirror the opening section of Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress, which exclusively follows a pair of bickering peasants as they split up and are captured again before meeting the film's protagonist. But a few of his filmmaker friends with whom he had shared early plot outlines thought that audiences would be unwilling to follow a story that is just droids for such a long chunk of the film's first act. As a quick aside, this is my favorite part of any Star Wars movie, and I'd be happy if the droids never met anyone and just wandered around in a weird desert for 9 movies over the span of 5 decades. Lucas wrote and filmed the subplot to try to ground the film in human drama, but was criticized by another friend in the film industry, maybe Brian De Palma, for making, quote, American graffiti in space. And the subplot was cut to return focus to some good old-fashioned sandy droid action. So we have peer pressure to thank for both these deleted scenes and the final version of the film's first act. But anyway, the film continues. Strangely though, after the droids are reunited in the Sandcrawler, we cut to the Death Star for this scene, which in the theatrical version comes much later on. Aside from that strange placement, there are a couple of interesting things to point out here. Again, you'll hear David Prowse's Darth Vader voice, which never really gets old.
The technical information you refer to will soon be back in our hands.
And he even has a little bit of extra dialogue.
Don't be too proud of this technological terror you've created. The ability to destroy a planet, indeed a whole system, is insignificant compared with the cosmic force.
But more importantly, Darth Vader is referred to as a Sith Lord sent by the Emperor.
This Sith Lord sent by the Emperor will be our undoing.
The term Sith first appeared in a Star Wars film in 1999's The Phantom Menace.
The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
And most people think of it as a strictly prequel-era concept, but it actually traces its history back to one of Lucas's very first Star Wars story treatments. Still, it's surprising to hear it pop up all the way back in the original film, and I think it would have actually been another cool piece of world building. It's kind of strange that Lucas didn't add that line back in for the special editions. It would have tied the saga together in a really subtle way, and I don't think anyone would have minded. The other interesting tidbit is a reference to the Death Star being something of a vanity project for Grand Moff Tarkin.
I think the construction of this station has more to do with Governor Tarkin's bid for recognition than any prudent military strategy.
This adds a bit more depth to the relationships between the Imperial officers, which will be touched on again in another deleted scene. And it ties into the way Tarkin is portrayed in Rogue One. I think. I'm not a Rogue One fan.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
The placement of this scene here interrupts the flow of the story being told. There are a few more examples of this as we go along. The way that the two parallel storylines, stuff with the good guys on Tatooine and stuff with the Empire, is cut together different between the two versions. But again, you'll notice how the theatrical version does a lot of work to focus the first act solely on the droids and their journey to Luke. That's why this irrelevant scene was replaced with the scene of the stormtroopers searching the planet for the droids.
Look, sir, droids.
That scene in the Lost Cut happens after the quick morning scene between Beru and Owen. It's strange to have it here, since it seems to be setting up the stormtroopers as the immediate threat to Luke and the droids, but we quickly see that it's the Tusken Raiders that will be the next force to cause harm to our heroes. Maybe it's meant to be a subversion to show just how dangerous and unpredictable the galaxy is, like we're worried about stormtroopers, but then a Tusken Raider pops up and catches us by surprise. But I think the second set of editors was smart to rearrange these scenes the way they did. After R2-D2 runs away from Luke and 3PO, they go after him in Luke's landspeeder. Originally, the effect in this scene was done with a rear projection screen.
Oh, Ben lives out in this direction somewhere. It was just, I don't see how that R2 unit could have come this far. We must have missed him. Uncle Owen's not going to take this very well.
Lucas hated the way it looked, and requested the talented guys at ILM, who were inventing new technologies left and right, find a better way to do it. Ultimately, the effect was done in wide shots driving through the desert, while the vehicle's wheels were obstructed by either a mirror, Vaseline on the camera's lens, or rocks in the foreground. Oh wait, I forgot a deleted scene from earlier.
Charlie?
Come on, would it really hurt to put this one back in? Once R2 has been found, The Tusken Raiders attack, and Luke is thrown to the ground. There's the iconic shot of the Raider, played by stuntman Peter Diamond, shaking his staff above his head, but it's actually an editing trick.
And then he holds his weapon up over his head, and he just did it once, and we rocked it back and forth, so he did it a number of times. The only things that are there is what's presentable, and...
So it's essentially an Instagram boomerang. So now we're at Ben's bachelor pad. Apparently there exists an alternate establishing shot here, but this hasn't been confirmed and I don't have anything to show you. But I can show you how the interior conversation played out in the lost cut. This is a pretty interesting one, but I'm warning you, once you hear about it, you won't be able to watch the scene the same way again. You may have noticed the way that C-3PO is asleep and awake seemingly at random throughout the scene, even after asking Luke's permission to switch off.
Sir, if you'll not be needing me, I'll close down for a while.
Sure, go ahead.
That's because this entire sequence has been shuffled around and takes place out of order, as part of the aforementioned second wave of editing done in an effort to save Star Wars with creative choices. Hirsch, Chew, and the Lucases sometimes had to prioritize the overall film experience over moment-to-moment continuity. There are lots of examples of this throughout. For one, a cutaway to R2-D2 after the red droid blows up is a continuity-breaking shot from earlier. See the red droid still there in the background? And then there's the example of this shot of R2 with the Death Star background that's used as a reaction to 3PO tangled in wires, and during his holo chess game with Chewie. Huh, these are all about R2-D2, aren't they? You think he's like some kind of transcendent being that causes ripples in the film's continuity? Does R2-D2 know he's in a movie? Does D2 stand for Deadpool 2? In the scripted version of the Lost Cut assembly, the scene opens with Ben playing Princess Leia's message while Luke works on 3PO.
This is our most desperate hour. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
After the message, Luke questions Ben about his involvement in the Clone Wars.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
Which leads to talk about Luke's father, who was clearly not Darth Vader at this point in development, no matter what Lucas tells you.
No, my father didn't fight in the wars. He was a navigator on a spice freighter.
That's what your uncle told you. He didn't hold with your father's ideals, thought he should have stayed here and not gotten involved.
I wish I'd known him.
He was the best star pilot in the galaxy. And a cunning warrior. I understand you've become quite a good pilot yourself. And he was a good friend. Which reminds me, I have something here for you. Your father wanted you to have this.
C-3PO asks to take a nap.
Sir, if you'll not be needing me, I'll close down for a while.
While Ben shows Luke Anakin's lightsaber and gives him a brief history lesson.
Before the dark times. Before the Empire.
This talk quickly leads to an explanation of the Force.
And the Force is what gives the Jedi his power.
And Luke's invitation to join Ben on his trip to Alderaan.
You must learn the ways of the Force if you're to come with me to Alderaan.
Alderaan?
Where the scene plays out to its end, or a version of it.
Right now I don't feel too good.
When the film was re-edited, a lot of these little beats and lines of dialogue were shuffled around to make the scene play more dynamically. For example, the scene now starts in the middle of the conversation with Luke's line about his father being a navigator on the spice freighter.
No, my father didn't fight in the wars. He was a navigator on a spice freighter.
It's good screenwriting to start a scene as late into a conversation as possible. That's common advice given for writing compelling scripts, so I think that's probably what the editors were going for. I can only assume that they also felt that splitting Ben and Luke's conversation about the Force into two parts as bookends to the Leia hologram would help liven up the pace of the scene. I don't know how I feel about it, to be honest. I think I might actually prefer the scene in its original form better. I like the slow burn of the hanging threat left by Leia's plea, and the subtle manipulation Ben performs on Luke to try to get him interested in joining through the rest of the scene. At least that's the way I interpret it. After this scene, we go back to the Death Star where Leia is about to be tortured. In the final film, this has become the home of that Imperial conference room meeting, but was originally used to pump up tension and concern for Leia's safety. I could see the argument for keeping the scene where it was, honestly, but it's not a big deal, and the fact that I never noticed that all these scenes were shuffled around is maybe proof that they made the right choice. In the theatrical version of the film, this torture scene comes during a cutaway from Luke's 15-second grieving period. In the Lost Cut, though, this whole subplot has been fast-tracked as we've seen, so the film is already on to the following scene by that point, Vader and the Imperials deciding to set course for the Alderaan system.
Perhaps she would respond to an alternative form of persuasion.
Geez, slow down, the Lost Cut. There's no need to rush. Let's get to Mos Eisley. What do you think? We still have a lot to get to.
You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. We must be cautious.
I'm ready for anything.
The Cantina is a big one, and it's pretty easy to talk about with some degree of certainty, because the entire Lost Cut version of the sequence is available to the public. The Cantina's interior was filmed at Elstree Studios in England, along with most of the other interior sets. The Lost Cut version of the scene features some characters that didn't make it into the final cut, including a girl named Jenny that Han flirts with throughout much of the scene. And a lot of these alien creatures were deemed unsatisfactory to Lucas from a design and performance standpoint. He really needed this sequence to work. We might take it for granted today, just how innovative the Cantina sequence was to audiences in 1977. Bill Murray sang a song about it.
And hey, how about that nutty Star Wars bar? Can you forget all the creatures in there?
But if it hadn't worked, it would have been a disaster. George Lucas did reshoots in Los Angeles to add more creatures to the mix. Those reshoot aliens are pretty easy to identify. They never appear at the bar or at Han and Chewie's table, only at their own isolated booths. Just a quick side note here, but since production was done in England, most minor characters throughout the whole film are played by British actors. They were pretty much all dubbed over by American actors in this film, but some of the Imperial officers were allowed to keep their British accents in the sequels, because I guess British equals evil. But anyway, you'll notice distinctly English accents on the bartender.
Hey, we don't serve their kind here.
What?
The droids, they'll have to wait outside. We don't want them in.
And Dr. Evazan.
I don't like you either. You just watch yourself. We're wanted men. I have the death sentence on 12 systems.
Speaking of the Good Doctor, after their altercation, Obi-Wan whips out his lightsaber and cuts off Ponda Baba's arm. In the theatrical version, his hand has fingers. In the Lost Cut version, though, the hand looks more distinctly alien, like a hoof or a squid's tentacle or something, I don't know. But, and this is a big one, there's actually another version of this shot. You guys know about this? What if Obi-Wan had not cut off Ponda Baba's arm, but instead sliced his neck? Yeah, and they actually shot this version. Crazy, right? So why change it from a decapitation to a simple dismemberment? Maybe they thought having the hero's mentor character straight up cut a guy's head off would be a little confusing tonally speaking. And speaking of confusing tonally speaking, Han chooses to make his move on Jenny directly following Obi-Wan cutting off this poor guy's arm or head or whatever. What the hell is going on in this crazy alien bar? Next we see a little more from the witness who decides to snitch on Obi-Wan and Luke to the stormtroopers. And then we meet Han after he gets rid of Jenny.
Sweetheart.
Presumably never to see her again? She seemed cool. We're business as usual here for a while.
Chewie here tells me you're looking for passage to the Alderaan system.
Yes, indeed. If it's a fast ship.
Until Han and Chewie leave.
Get her ready.
Only for the former to get stopped by Greedo.
Going somewhere solo.
Chewbacca, a great friend that he is, just keeps on walking and leaves his best friend at Rodian gunpoint. In the theatrical edit, we jump to a quick shot of Ben and Luke leaving the cantina to split up this interaction.
That's okay. I'm never coming back to this planet again.
It's clear that this is all the same shot once you realize that, though. Greedo's scene is quite a bit different than this version. I know, add another version to the tally on this stupid scene. Sadly, he doesn't say McClunky yet.
McClunky.
It wasn't in the budget. His lines to Han are significantly different, as you can hear.
But it's too late. I'm not going back to Jabba with another one of your stories.
Yeah, but this time I've got the money.
Then I'll take it now.
For one, they're delivered on set by actor Paul Blake.
It's too late. Jabba would rather have your...
The content of the dialogue is different because the scene between Han and Jabba, human Jabba, played by a Northern Irish character actor, is still in this cut of the film. We'll get there, but a lot of the material from what we now know as the official version of the Greedo scene is spread between this scene and the Jabba scene. When the decision was made to cut the Jabba scene, Greedo was dubbed in an alien language and given the necessary information from both scenes.
Now you come outside with me. Or must I finish it here?
I don't think they'd like another killing in here.
They've hardly noticed. Get up.
And for the record, Han shoots first.
Yes, I'll bet you have.
As the stormtroopers searched the streets, there was a little extra beat featuring a bunch of crazy creatures walking around.
Dennis?
This little vignette was cut, but was salvaged for the Star Wars Holiday Special as a portion of the Life on Tatooine broadcast.
Time now for Life on Tatooine, brought to viewers everywhere in the hope that our own lives may be uplifted by the comparison and enriched with the gratitude of relief. This transmission is unrehearsed and unedited, and is hereby begun without further comment as to its lack of moral value.
In the last cut of the film, this adds a little bit of that documentary flair that has been noted about the cut. When the stormtroopers finally do find the street where the droids were hiding, you might notice something a little different. In the theatrical version, the droids seal themselves in the door at the beginning of the scene, before the stormtroopers knock on the door. This is actually another clever editing technique though. In the lost cut and the shooting script, the droids do not reveal themselves to the audience until the end of the scene, as sort of a mild surprise. If you look closely, it's pretty obvious that this shot of the door closing is played in reverse. It was originally a shot of the door opening. Alfred Hitchcock once wrote about the difference between surprise and suspense. He used an example of a scene where two people are having a conversation with a bomb underneath a table. In one version of the scene, the audience doesn't learn about the bomb until it explodes at the end of the scene. This is surprise, and it only lasts a few seconds. In the second version of the scene, the audience is shown the bomb under the table at the beginning of the scene, and the entire conversation between the two people is charged by our fear that the bomb will go off at any second. This is suspense and is much more effective.
McClunky.
It's clear all these years later that this was the actual scene that he was referring to, and he just substituted bomb under table for droids behind door. As minor of a change as it seems, it just proves the difference in philosophy between the editors. There was much more of a thought for creating drama and intrigue after the lackluster lost cut. Shortly later, we see Jabba appear in the flesh and have a conversation with Han.
You didn't think I was going to run, did you?
Ah, my boy, there are times you disappoint me. Why haven't you paid me? And why did you have to fry poor Greedo like that, after all we've been through together?
Look, Jabba, next time you want to talk to me, come see me yourself. Don't send one of these twerps.
Of course, this scene was re-added to the special edition 20 years later. But the film and trilogy just work so much better without it. Sorry, Declan Mulholland, you were a necessary sacrifice. Losing this scene livens up the pace and makes the reveal of the Falcon itself much more impressive when we finally get to it.
What a piece of junk.
From this deleted scene, we go directly to another. This time, it's Vader and an Imperial commander walking down the hallway and talking about the internal politics of their bureaucracy like they're in an Aaron Sorkin movie.
Send in more troops if you have to. It's her hope that data being used against us, which is the pillar of her resistance to our mind probe.
Till then, we waste time with Governor Tarkin's foolish plan to break her.
It's another unnecessary and redundant scene that cuts what's left of the microplot about Tarkin being too ambitious for his own good. It was also salvaged and redubbed for the holiday special.
Started a search operation. It's just a matter of time before we find the rebels.
I want the rebels located and identified, if it means searching every household in the system.
Back in Docking Bay 94, the stormtroopers finally catch up to our heroes and a shootout takes place. The lost cut features a quick beat that shows that the Falcon has automatic guns on its hull. These short shots were repurposed for the Falcon's escape from Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back. Called recycling, kids. As the Falcon blasts away, Luke and Ben run to put their seatbelts on in the theatrical version.
Oh my, I've forgotten how much I hate space travel.
In the lost cut though, they don't do this until Han tells them to later on.
Both trap yourselves in, I'm gonna make the jump to light speed.
Again, it probably makes a little more logical sense to keep it as it was in the script and the lost cut, but it's not as dramatic. There are a few extra beats in the scene with Alderaan's destruction.
What? Dantooine is too remote to make an effective demonstration. We will deal with your rebel friends soon enough.
No.
Bang!
And you call yourselves human. You are far too trusting. And very soon, you will see your hopeless rebellion vanish in a similar fashion.
And now the two parallel plots are back in sync with how we know them from the final version of the film. You know what? Let's just run through the rest of the Death Star sequence, lightning round style. Here are some of the little differences that would have appeared in the lost cut.
You can't win, Darth. If my blade should find its mark, you will cease to exist. And I warn you, if you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Look, a minute ago you said you didn't want to just wait here and be captured. Now all you want to do is stay?
Marching into the detention area is not what I had in mind.
But they're gonna kill her!
Better her than me.
No, hon. I've seen her. She's so beautiful.
So is life.
Can we just leave this party?
Give us a growl.
We ran into some old friends.
Is the ship all right? Seems okay. If we can get to it. I just hope the old man got the tractor beam out of commission.
Look.
Now's the chance. Go!
Here they come. gonna need it.
There she is.
Chief Review, do you copy?
I'll read you, sir.
Are you safe?
Hold a moment. We're in the hangar across from the ship.
Keep going, clear the corridor!
Now.
Jack! Keep in the doorway! No! Come on!
Okay, cool. As the rebel fighters prepare to depart, Luke reunites with his old friend Biggs. Of course, you'll remember the scene from having been reinstated into the film in 1997, but here it's just one more piece of a larger subplot. The Lost Cut also likely used a different take of the scene than the one that's now in the film, which retained Red Leader's passing reference to Luke's father, which was covered up by a pilot walking in front of the foreground in the final version.
Listen, have I got some stories to tell you?
You sure you can handle this ship, sir?
Luke is the best bush pilot in the Outer Rim territories.
I met your father once when I was just a boy. He was a great pilot. You've got half the skill he had, you'll do all right.
I gotta get aboard. We'll hear all your stories when we get back, all right?
Right. Hey, Biggs. I told you I'd make it someday.
It'll be like old times, Luke. They'll never stop us.
I really like the scene, actually, even in the special edition of the film. I'm glad it's back. The final major difference in this Lost Cut is a lack of stakes for the climactic battle. In this original assembly, the Death Star was not preparing to destroy the Rebel base. The script seems to imply that the Rebel pilots and the Death Star travel towards each other, not far from the planet of Yavin. There's no imminent threat to the Rebels back in the base, though, which was smartly altered with some insert shots and voiceover dialogue to imply the Death Star's plan to blow up the entire moon. Also, the space battle on the Death Star's surface is long. Super long. It's already pushing it in the final version of the film. In fact, that was one of Roger Ebert's only criticisms of Star Wars, and I tend to agree with him. The final trench run is fantastic, but the earlier parts of the battle drag a little and feel too tech demo-y, I think. But the version that was scripted and assembled in the Lost Cut proves it could have been much worse. Like I said, there's no tension propelling the action, and there are several extra beats and lines of dialogue between the pilots. Luke also makes a first failed bombing run before doing the whole thing again. Again, it's probably more realistic that it would happen this way, but the way it was cut down by the second group of editors is much, much better filmmaking.
Glad you were here to see it. Now let's get some distance before that thing goes supernova.
So yeah, in a nutshell, that's the Lost Cut of Star Wars. There's no doubt it's an inferior overall piece in the final theatrical version, but I think it's pretty fascinating to study this earlier draft of something we all know and love. Let me know what you think down below. Do you wish some of these changes hadn't been made? Have I got any big Fixer and Cammy fans in my audience? Or do you think the Lost Cut should stay lost? And before anyone asks, of course I'm doing more of these. I've already started on Empire and Jedi videos, even though there's no actual lost cuts of those films, but still, there are a lot of cool deleted and alternate scenes. Stay tuned. I'd even like to do the prequels if enough people are into it. As always, like and subscribe, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter. That's a new thing I'm trying out.